Dwyer is the Managing Director of Edge Effect and has come from Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Edge Effect is an organisation which focuses on the inclusion of sexual and gender minorities, it's a language we prefer to use, including trans, non-binary, gender diverse people in the humanitarian development sector. So we're very happy to be here and to commend the focus on Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals for this event. And I draw our attention to paragraphs 96 and 97 of the report of the independent expert presented to the Human Rights Council yesterday. The call on states to develop specific programs and policies to end the spiral of discrimination, marginalisation and exclusion that have a negative impact on the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and gender non-confirming persons, including their rights to health, education, work and an adequate standard of living, and to take affirmative action to address structural discrimination and to remedy socio-economic inequalities. Now, in focusing on trans dimensions of this structural discrimination and socio-economic inequality, I want to focus on a story. It's a tragic story, and it's important for all of us to acknowledge that the story that you're about to hear is the story of a real person, and to pay respect to her. The story, I also need to provide a content warning, does include rape and violence. And so please do look after yourself, and if this is a space that you need to leave briefly and to seek some assistance from someone here, then please do so. It's a story which you can find in a publication of the Asia Pacific Transgender Network. It's a story of a woman by the name of Sharon, who was a trans woman. She was smart, she finished year 12 at secondary school, and she got a place to study at university. However, because of her identity, her family did not support her in continuing her education. Sharon was 20 at that time and ended up on the street doing sex work and drag shows at nightclubs. One night, after doing a drag show, Sharon was trying to get home in a taxi, and she gave the taxi driver directions and then fell asleep because she was tired from working, and she didn't realise where the taxi driver was taking her. She woke up when 5 men dragged her out of the cab and started bashing her and raping her. Sharon was found by 2 women who brought her to the hospital. However, she felt judged and discriminated against by the clients and healthcare workers. So Sharon got up from her seat in the hospital waiting room without getting treatment and left for home. 3 months later, Sharon came to a community clinic for an HIV test and was positive. Sharon was scared to tell her family, so she moved out of home and stayed on the streets. She declined ART and eventually died after contracting tuberculosis. And when Sharon died, her body was not collected by her relatives. The question that I would like to pose to the room is, why did Sharon die? And of course, there are many reasons why Sharon died. The lack of acceptance from her family, work that she may have chosen but that increased vulnerability, violence enacted upon her, discrimination at the hospital, discrimination that probably meant that Sharon didn't seek assistance from law enforcement. The discrimination, the violence that we experience is multi-layered, it's multi-dimensional. There are many points in Sharon's story where her life, though, probably could have taken a different path, and many of those reflect the work of development actors, both state and non-state actors, work that we could and should be undertaking. Trans people are whole people, and we have many aspects of our lives. However, I think development actors have often focused on trans lives as lives that have health problems through HIV, STI and other health programs, and haven't necessarily understood that as whole people we have many concerns. For example, the country in which Sharon lived had an NGO which supports programs to address violence against women and girls. However, those programs do not address violence experienced by trans women. If they did, maybe Sharon would have gone there. There are many other development programs that could and should address the needs of trans and non-binary people. For example, economic development and entrepreneurship or microfinance programs that could assist transgender and non-binary people to develop livelihoods out of the narrow range of acceptable professions that trans and non-binary people are often pushed into. Of course, we know that sexual and gender minorities, including trans and non-binary people, are not explicitly referenced in the Sustainable Development Goals, nor in other development frameworks such as the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction. So we are forced to read ourselves back into development policy and practice, and this takes time and effort, and unfortunately is a responsibility which is pushed back onto the marginalised. What might good practice involve in a development context? Well, good practice in this context certainly involves more than tokenism, and too often we see some version of LGBTIQ or SOGIESC added to long lists of marginalised groups, but without specific action on detailed policy and practice. Too often we see gender identity or sexual orientation defined in the glossaries or mentioned in the introduction of documents to help organisations design development programs and policies, only to see those terms and issues vanish when thematic policy and practice guides get into the detail. Good practice certainly does not involve adding trans, non-binary people and stirring, no more so than involving women in good practice. It needs to start at the beginning of processes and projects. And for example, we've been fortunate to advise a new Australian Government water sanitation and hygiene program called Water for Women on the inclusion of trans and non-binary people, to advise all of the NGOs that are part of that program across the Asia Pacific, and to ensure from the very beginning of the program that Water for Women means water for all women, including trans women. Good practice certainly involves thinking beyond LGBTIQ, firstly because LGBTIQ reflects categories of the global north and west, and diverse gender and sexuality in the global south and east is not included, including identities from Indigenous and colonised societies. But also because trans issues are not always addressed by broad LGBTIQ organisations. Good practice also involves understanding that gender in gender development programs does not equal only cisgendered women, nor cisgendered women and girls, men and boys. Good practice involves going beyond labels and requires development actors to address heteronormativity, cisnormativity, binarism and dietism, assumptions that underpin so much of our society. Who counts as a family for the purpose of development programs? Do 8 trans women living in an apartment represent a household? The multidimensional marginalisation experienced by trans people undermines our attempts to build resilient livelihoods. And this is bad enough in everyday life, but takes on new dimensions during humanitarian emergencies. In February 2016, Category 5 tropical cyclone Winston devastated parts of Fiji. But the official post-development needs assessment for TC Winston does not mention transgender nor non-binary people, or the traditional third gender Vakase Lualua people of Fiji. The rapid gender assessment made only passing mention of LGBT people, and trans people were also invisible in the United Nations flash appeal. Many of the tools that humanitarians use also render trans and non-binary people invisible. For example, sex and age disaggregated data collection tools, the gender marker system used by many organisations, which is based on the gender binary and does not provide ways to assess inclusivity of transgender people in humanitarian programs. In emergencies, it's especially important to recognise that transgendered men, trans women and other gender diverse people have specific needs, and the work that we did in Fiji in collecting stories of sexual and gender minorities illustrated this, that some trans women were happy to be in shelters with cisgendered women, some certainly were not. Some trans men wanted to be in shelters with men because those were the people they worked with, and it was cisgendered women with people who gave them grief. We need that diversity in our responses, or we need to be able to refer people to informal networks and within sexual and minority communities. This example is not isolated. And so in Indonesia, after the eruption of Mount Merapi some years ago, some trans people did not go to evacuation centres, as they assumed that the violence and discrimination that they experience in everyday life would also be happening there. And earlier in 2004, the third gender Aravani community was heavily marginalised when the Indian Ocean tsunami devastated parts of the coast of Tamil Nadu. In order, in that emergency, to receive humanitarian assistance, you needed to show a government-issued ration card. However, to get a ration card, you needed to tick one of 2 boxes, male or female. Remember, Aravanis are a third gender people, neither men nor women, and because they didn't fit into either box, many Aravanis did not have ration cards, and as a consequence did not receive humanitarian assistance. This was compounded because the non-government organisations that included gender considerations in their humanitarian response did not have a policy or practice that included non-binary gender groups. And so the Aravanis did not receive food relief, access to shelter, government cash handouts, and this exclusion reinscribed the existing discrimination experienced by Aravani people before the disaster. Last week I was in Cox's Bazar training humanitarian staff about the challenges faced by sexual and gender minorities in humanitarian emergencies. And sadly, we could not talk in detail about trans, third gender, or other sexual and gender minorities amongst the host community or the Rohingya refugees. Because for cultural and religious reasons, there's a sense that it's not possible to include trans and other sexual and gender minorities within assessments. And while, of course, the commitment to do no harm is paramount, it means that we do not have the evidence base in which to develop or adjust programs to be inclusive of trans and non-binary people. I just want to emphasise finally that in building this evidence base, which is crucial if we are to design and fund development programs and humanitarian programs which are inclusive of trans and non-binary people, that trans voices need to be centred. The organisation I work for uses storytelling to centre the lived experience of sexual and gender minorities. Storytelling, especially where those people gathering stories are themselves trans, provides an opportunity to build trust that will often not be there when others do the research. There are all kinds of reasons why people will not and should not need to expose themselves in order that their experiences be valued and their experiences be included in humanitarian and development programs. It is essential to understand the contours of trans experiences if we are to design, let's say, to fund programs also, and to fund local organisations in the many countries where trans and non-binary people are excluded. And I think maybe that's a good point to end on and to pass the baton over, that there are so many differences in trans experiences, third gender and non-binary experiences in so many different parts of the world that it's possible for international and regional organisations to talk about these issues. But we really need to hear from and respect the experiences of trans, non-binary, third gender people in those countries, and for those experiences, for those organisations to be centred in the design. Nothing for us without us.